We often hear that there has to be conflict in every scene. Can we break down what this really means?
I think when the idea of conflict in every scene, it's like, well, where does the scene go? That's part of it, right? Does the scene arc? If it's just information can be pretty dull. So then it's like, okay, well then where's the conflict in the information? It's like, well, maybe the information creates the conflict. Character realizes he just got a huge inheritance. But the problem is now other people nearby are going to want that money. So now all of a sudden that scene has conflict in it. So I think like a conflict means like it has some energy to it. And conflict, by the way, is every genre. Horror, comedy. I mean, think of comedy is conflict, because comedy is always about wrong turns, problems, right? And drama is that too. So I think, yeah, without conflict, you run that risk. I would say, like, that's a flat line. If your EKG shows that, that's not good, right? If your script shows that, also maybe not the best thing. Now, there are sometimes a scene that, this is a great moment. I'm going to old school again. I am so sorry. I swear I've seen recent films, but The Natural, about a baseball player, older baseball player, also Robert Redford, director of Quiz Show. And there's this great moment I love that it's just the team is winning. And so we have this nice little moment that I think you could argue doesn't have much conflict in it, where it's just them practicing, but they're happy. And they have changed their attitude. And so even though this moment doesn't necessarily have much conflict in it, it does show a change of the character of the team. So even without conflict, it does have an arc. It's part of the arc of the team's character. And then it also has an important moment where, for the first time, they watch Roy Hobbs, played by Robert Redford, pitch. And you realize he's a natural-born pitcher. But you also see it hurts him when he pitches because he had been shot. It's a really great film, fabulous music too. But that's a moment that doesn't necessarily have much underlying conflict, but I think it still works. So if there isn't some kind of conflict between characters in the scene, then I think the question becomes, okay, well, what's the scene add to the whole? Like, why have it? What's the arc? Where do we go? I always use the term, how does the needle move? So if the needle hasn't moved at all, then what's the point of the scene? And exposition can have conflict in it. Terminator, when he has to explain what a T-800 is, I believe that's the model of Arnold, it's also happening as they're being chased. And so Reese has to tell Sarah Connor, no relation, all these things, or else Sarah's going to jump out of a moving car. So thus you have a lot of exposition, but it's wrapped in conflict. It's them driving for their lives, And so thus, like, the exposition is purposeful. And it's said for a reason. I think you're always looking for, like, if there's no conflict in the scene, it could end very quickly. It's like a one-punch knockout. So if a character needs something, if I want to steal your camera, and I go, hey, can I borrow your camera? And you go, sure. Well, that wasn't very interesting. If you say no, and then I have to finagle a way to get that camera, well, there's conflict. There's obstacles. And then the scene is going someplace, so it's not just this.
And conflict can also show who a character is and
Right.
bring out more of them, their personality. Like, I'm going to date myself with this one, but Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Ah, yes.
And so Steve Martin, all the conflict that he's sort of encountering is reinforcing sort of this corporate, like, elitist guy, whereas John Candy, things just kind of flow to the
Right.
guy, and nobody's mad at him, and actually people want to go out of their way and help him, and so it kind of informs who these two are.
Right, conflict, it's, I think a term I'll use sometimes is put the characters in the wild. So, like, characters shouldn't be in vacuums. They're not in their own little isolated pods, except for maybe Wally, right? But the truth is, like, yeah, you learn so much about characters, how they deal with conflict. And, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is great comedy, but it also has pathos. But the one doesn't hurt the other because there's constant conflict between them. And then also, of course, by the way, conflict between a character and themselves, right? Like, that's oftentimes the biggest conflict you can create is like, well, what's stopping someone? Why doesn't that character just say, I love you? is making it hard for themselves to get what they want or need. So conflict can come from outside or inside. And I think in the end of it all, you look at each scene, and if you ask yourself, well, how's it move the needle? How's it arc? How is this helping the overall flow? Then a scene always has a reason to exist, even if it's just a bunch of dudes kind of hanging around playing baseball and having fun. It's like, yeah, but compared to how miserable they were just a few scenes ago, it's an important moment.
How does emotion factor into a great scene?
Well, I think it's interesting. The emotion is, well, you have the emotions of the character. Then you also have the emotions of the audience that you gotta maybe think about a little bit. You know, if you put a subject in peril, like ask questions like, well, do we care? It's a trick they do on like all those medical shows. You meet these characters and they're guest stars, right? They're only gonna be in this episode. They have some unusual condition that's gonna take them all 5 acts of the episode to figure out. What are you gonna do up front to make us actually care? You know, so that life or death is on the line here, but we care if they pull through. And so I think like that's where you think about a little bit of the emotion of the audience. It's like, well, how are we gonna connect with this character? And it doesn't mean every character has to be super lovable. Tony Soprano wasn't lovable, but we connected with him, we understood him. So what makes the character connectable? What makes it so the audience will actually have some skin in the game? The audience will feel something if something happens to them. Root for them or root against them, by the way. Great villains, of course. And then I think also within the scene, within the characters, even if they're not humans, Wally was not a human character, but you always could understand what he was feeling. You know, and it's hats off to the brilliant artists over at Pixar. Great writing. It was up for a screenplay Oscar, I believe, but also just how you always understood emotionally what he was thinking and feeling, just by a little move of his eyes or his visors, whatever they were on top of his eyes. You know, and so I think, yeah, it always goes back to emotion, right? Even if it's a silly film, even if it's a comedy, even if it's a slasher. You know, the truth is, like, the first thing I always say to people working in horror as their genre of choice is like, well, what scares you? You know, it's not a bad place to start, even if it's not what you're writing about. But like being able to remember the emotions. Like some of us were afraid of going in our own basements. LA doesn't have many basements, but us who grew up elsewhere, right, we had basements, and usually something scary was down there, like an old washer dryer or a burner with a furnace. If you remember, Kevin McAllister in Home Alone was terrified of his burner. Then he wasn't so terrified to almost kill 2 random men, but that burner scared him throughout the film until he conquered that fear. But that's a writer, John Hughes, who clearly has a memory of these things, remembers what it was like to feel these things, to feel scared of something. And I think emotions, it kind of keeps us honest, right? If you ask those questions of like, well, what are they feeling? Like, why are they acting this way? A lot of times when movies might lose me a little bit is when characters act in ways that don't make sense for the character. That feels like, well, they're trying to add drama, but emotionally it feels false.
Right, like The Exorcist might be far more scarier than, let's say, Nightmare on Elm Street, just because fear of the supernatural and sort of than some deranged creature that's following you or something.
Right. It's like, I remember seeing Friday the 13th Part 2 when I was way too young. And then my buddy and I that night were trying to go to sleep, and we both were absolutely convinced that Jason came in through the window of my house. And to this day, he's still one of my closest friends. We'll bring that up every now and again because it was such a vivid memory. But yeah, that totally was the thing that got us. Nightmare on Elm Street didn't scare me as much when I was a kid. I loved them.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But Jason, I was always afraid of an actual Jason somewhere out there.
Right.
I think I still am.
What's the most perfect screenplay that you recommend to your students?
Oh, that's a great question. The most perfect screenplay. Definitely there's not one. It'd be funny if I said, oh yeah, the one I wrote. Here it is. I think, you almost have to look at it as like, okay, perfect for what? So perfect horror, perfect comedy. Tootsie is one of my very favorites. Again, old school, I'm sorry. I promise I watch newer films. But Tootsie was also, what's fascinating is how much they changed it in post-production. So I can look at that film and tell you probably 100 reasons why I think it's one of the great screenplays, and yet so much of it got changed. So much of it was made kind of like what it takes to turn a coal into a diamond, under duress, or how a pearl gets created, right? It takes an agitation for a pearl to be formed. It's like a secretion on top of the agitation. Sometimes movies go through that. So in the case of Tootsie, I don't know if I've come across the original script, but knowing the script that basically is the film, it for my money is one of the perfect comedies. But then that doesn't necessarily mean if someone's writing a drama, it's something I would recommend, because it's great for its genre. So then you look over like, well, what's a perfect drama? Well, I don't know if it's perfect, but I thought like a recent one, Manchester by the Sea, because it was all about emotional truth. Character finds out he's dying, and there are a bunch of, Boston sort of, tough guys. And so they're swearing at each other, yelling, arguing. It's a heartbreaking scene and it's hysterical all at once. That's pretty special. That's one of those, like, you watch it, like, wow, okay. That takes another level of writing and directing and acting to make that work. Because that could have been such a mess of a scene. Instead, you feel it. And it's incredibly believable. It's very human, the drama of that. And so what I love about that, what to me makes that a perfect script, is so different than what makes Tootsie a perfect script. There's a lot of crossover, rooted in character, plant and payoff, but the things that make that such an interesting read is very different than what makes Tootsie an interesting read.
Do you find your students enjoy reading scripts that are 20 plus years old, that there's a nostalgia there?
I think part of this, like, we literally have a class that's genre. And so one thing genre does is it necessitates students look at older films. I think that's where I try to mix it up. So, She Said, I mentioned, it was just the script's only a couple of years old. I'll use something like that, but then I'll use something maybe from the 80s or 70s even. Sometimes even the 60s, The Apartment, Billy Wilder's amazing movie. I think it deepens an understanding of cinema when you can speak a bit of cinema history, but at the same time, it's such a different industry now. Even Tootsie, which I love, it might not work now in 2025. I think there's questions of gender that it doesn't address at all, gender identity, that if you're doing 2025, you would have to. And so I think, like, there are movies that work in that time, and you have to understand it works in that time. There's also movies that I just avoid from the past. Like, what's it? Not From Here to Eternity. Oh my God, Rhett Butler, Scarlett O'Hara, Gone with the Wind. Yeah, Gone with the Wind is a remarkable cinematic achievement. It is troubling, though, to look at the politics within that. And it's in some ways, like, as great a piece of cinema as it is, there's other ones you can find that I think can work without students bumping their head up against it. And understandably, So I think there are other stories you can find that maybe have, like, the sweeping beauty of that film without its sort of troubling undercurrents, if you will. But that's a real challenge, right, in 2025. You always got to think about what speaks to students right now. And our students are not but one age, Some of the students are only a little bit younger than me. So kind of making sure it's something that could speak to everyone. And not every movie will, and that's why we try to have a really good variety of content to make sure a lot of bases are covered.